The Flipped Classroom Podcast. What does a flipped classroom look like? Presented by Jeffrey Anderson and Larry Hess from Ohio University. Learning objectives. After watching this podcast, you should be able to remember and understand some of the characteristics of a flipped classroom, 2 methods for structuring class discussion, and how class participation changes with the flipped model. First, let's look at the traditional classroom, where students sit passively and listen to the instructor, the sage on the stage, as he or she delivers course concepts via lecture. The flipped classroom looks much different. The flipped classroom, instructors work actively with students. Students work collaboratively in pairs or in teams to solve class problems, to apply concepts. In the flipped classroom is much more active and much more engaging, much more noisy, and much more interactive than the traditional classroom. It helps if we take a look at understanding today's college students. Mark Preskey coined the term digital natives, those who have grown up with technology. Born from 1981 to 2000, technology has been an everyday part of their life. This is important in terms of how these students expect to be engaged in the classroom and outside the classroom. Let's look at some characteristics of a flipped classroom. First, students typically reach higher orders of critical thinking, moving from the remembering and understanding domains to application and analysis. The flipped classroom provides the opportunity to give course material context by applying it to real-world situations. In the flipped model, students take ownership of their learning and can use material and use their knowledge to lead one another during class. And perhaps most importantly, the flipped classroom transforms students from passive listeners to active learners. Collaboration is at the heart of in-class activities used in the flipped classroom. One common method of promoting discussion in class is to use the think, pair, share technique. This technique requires that the learner first consider individually questions raised by the instructor. Then students are paired with their classmates and given time to discuss these questions together. Finally, the questions are shared with the class as students are called upon to answer by the professor. Another way to engage students with discussion is a technique called numbered heads together. In this technique, students are formed into teams of 3 to 6. They then count off, and each team member is assigned a number. The instructor then poses a question. Students put their heads together and discuss the issue so that everyone on the team knows and understands the answer. And then the instructor calls on students by number to answer the question for the class. We've all experienced situations where only a few students talk in class, and some students talk so much that they prevent others from speaking. When class discussions are out of balance, students feel excluded from the class. One way to maintain balance is to call on students by name regularly during the term in an evenly distributed way. Keeping track of who you've called upon allows this balance to be achieved. In this model, class participation goes from voluntary to mandatory. An instructor can use 2 types of questions when calling on students. First is the warm call method, where the instructor will identify students who will be called upon later to answer specific discussion questions. The intent of the warm call is to motivate students to be prepared to answer their assigned question thoughtfully and to get support from their peers as they prepare. Also, instructors should use cold calls, where they call upon students to answer questions without prior knowledge. These cold calls provide an incentive for students to think carefully about the issue, as there is always a possibility they will be called upon to answer in class. Summary. In this podcast, we reviewed some characteristics of the flipped classroom. The think, pair, share, and numbered heads together methods for structuring class discussion, and class participation, including warm calls and cold calls.